We've got some important things to talk about today. A Hebrew roots teacher who simply goes by the name Steve recently put out a video on Galatians 3 that's a little alarming. Steve used to be with 119 Ministries, and he's now started his own thing called Torah Family. And his teaching that we're going to look at is called the Tutor, Updated and Expanded. And in it, Steve tries to defend his Hebrew roots interpretation of Galatians 3 and verse 25 in particular. The reason I say that Steve's teaching is alarming is because it's demonstrably false, and I don't say that lightly. His conclusion is almost exactly the opposite of what the text actually says. Now, I wouldn't call his teaching intentionally deceptive because I think he really believes what he's saying, but it is deceptive because it leads his viewers to believe something different than what the Bible says. So if you're a fan of Steve's teachings or 119 Ministries, I think you're going to find what I'm about to show you pretty sobering. And Steve, if you're watching this, please prayerfully consider what I'm saying here. And I'm sure, like me, you feel the weight of James 3:1, which says that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness. So this is me correcting a brother on a teaching that's way off the mark. Okay, so here's how I'm going to approach this. I'm actually going to break it down into two parts. In today's video, we're going to carefully walk through Steve's teaching and hear from him in his own words to make sure that we rightly understand what he's saying. And I'm going to show you where and how his teaching veers off course. But it's not enough to merely expose what Steve got wrong. It's even more important to understand what Galatians 3 really does teach. So in part 2, which will be my next video, we're going to have ourselves a Bible study on Galatians chapter 3. But for today, let's dig deep into Steve's teaching. Before we jump into the teaching itself, I need to share 3 red flags or warning signs with you that just don't sit right with me. So first, as I was going through his teaching, I was following along with the scriptures on screen, and I came across something a little troubling. In his video, the text he shows on screen for Galatians 3:24 says this: "So the law was put in charge to lead us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith." Now, that wording sounded a little unusual to me, and it made me curious about which English translation he's using. And here's what I did to find out. And this is a good tip for you when you're doing your own testing. Go to BibleGateway.com and type in the verse you're looking for. I'll type in Gal 3:24. It shows you that verse in whatever the default translation is for you. And here's the tip. Click on this bottom link here to see this verse in all English translations. Now you can see that verse as it's worded in over 60 English translations. Now, this isn't every last English translation in the world, of course, but it includes all the major ones and many others you've never heard of. So here's what I did. I hit Command F for find, and then this search box pops up. So I just started typing in the wording exactly as Steve put it on screen. So, the law. And you see what's happening here? As I'm typing, the translations that match are being highlighted for me. So let's keep typing to narrow it down. Was put in charge. Aha, there we go. We're down to just one match, the NIRV. So that's the one translation that matches Steve's wording. It must be what he used, right? Nope. If we keep typing Steve's wording, to, lead, and now we've got 0 matches. Steve's wording doesn't match any of the 60 plus English translations shown here. That's a bit surprising. So I then checked a couple other translations that aren't included here, the Legacy Standard Bible and the Hebrew Names Version, and they didn't match either. So just to triple check, I did the same thing for verse 25. And Steve's version says, "Now that faith has come, we are no longer under the..." Oh, there we go again. None of these translations matches Steve's version. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that Steve's translation is wrong, just that it's odd that he's not using a known common translation. And I ended up checking a bunch of other verses in his video, and for almost all of them, I couldn't find a match. Why is this a big deal? Well, I don't know that it is a big deal yet, but here's the warning light that gets triggered. When the teacher's using let's call it a non-standard English translation, and they don't tell you what translation it is, the door's kind of left open for a mistranslation or even a manipulation to be smuggled into the text, especially since we know that Steve and 119 Ministries teach so many things that are at odds with traditional Christian interpretation. And the problem as a student sitting under a teacher like Steve is, well, which Bible do I open to read along with my teacher? And if you want to double check or even question things the teacher says, like I'm doing with Steve's teaching on Galatians 3, it becomes more difficult to talk through those issues without a common translation to reference. Which brings me to the second red flag. I went to comment on this video and asked Steve, hey, what translation are you using? But he doesn't allow comments on his YouTube channel. And that's also a warning sign for me. Now, I don't know Steve, so I have no idea why he doesn't allow anyone to comment on his videos. But in general, not allowing comments comes across like an unwillingness to engage with or even allow opposing viewpoints, and an unwillingness to defend one's teachings publicly. And the third red flag for me is that Steve doesn't share his last name. He identifies himself only as,
and I'm Steve from Torah Family.org.
I even went to his website and couldn't find his last name there either. I mean, he has a beautiful family and he seems like a kind and gentle man, but a Bible teacher hiding their last name is a little fishy to me if I'm being honest. I mean, can you think of any other Bible teacher who hides their last name? Now, I'll admit, the fact that a Bible teacher hides his last name, uses an unidentified translation of the Bible, and doesn't allow comments on his videos does not on its own mean his teachings are wrong. But when we add to that all of the errors we're about to look at, it starts to feel kind of sketchy. Now, I'm just stating facts here, and I could be wrong about what those facts mean. So let me say this. If Steve has good reasons for this approach, please let me know, because I will publicly retract my red flag statements if that's the case. And Steve, if you're watching, you can correct me in the comments section below. So let's take a look at this teaching. I've watched through Steve's video several times, and to be honest, it's a little hard to follow because he brings in a lot of other scriptures and he chases down a couple rabbit trails, as we all do. So to make sure I clearly understood what he's teaching, I created an outline of it, and I'll include a link to Steve's video and to my outline below so you can access both. So let's break this down into two steps. I'll first bring up some specific claims from Steve's video where he misses the mark, because identifying these errors will help set the stage for part 2, where we'll go through and break down Steve's teaching as he gave it. Okay, so let's start with an area where Steve is spot on. Okay, he makes an important point in his video that I want to underscore.
It's important to note that the law was never designed to save anyone. Never. It was designed for instruction, not salvation. When coming out of Egypt, we see salvation came at Passover. They were first delivered out of Egypt, and then Yahweh gave his instructions on how they were to live at Mount Sinai, showing that salvation came first.
I completely agree. Salvation has never come through obedience to the Torah. And Steve also mentions that Abraham was considered righteous because of his faith. Our walk has always been by faith. So Steve and I agree on that, okay? And then things start to get a little wonky. Because although Steve agrees that it's our faith that saves us, look at how he defines faith.
The faith of walking in obedience, just as the father of the faith did. But now through faith, we walk in obedience to him. And this faith Paul is talking about is the faith of walking in the Torah. Point being here is, our walk in the Torah is by faith.
Are you catching that? Steve defines faith not as belief or trust in God, but as walking in obedience to the Torah. Now, quick sidebar. It's important to understand that Hebrew roots teachers, including Steve, regularly use the term Torah to refer to the law of Moses. So when they say walking in the Torah, they mean obeying the law of Moses. And I wanted to point this out because it's one of those areas in Hebrew roots theology that can really lead to a lot of confusion. Okay, so Steve doesn't define faith as trust or belief in God, but rather as obeying the law of Moses. And this is a critical error. Don't miss this, because look at what it means. Steve says that salvation does not come from keeping the law, and we agree.
It's important to note that the law was never designed to save anyone.
So salvation doesn't come through the law, but through faith in God. So far, so good. But then Steve defines faith as walking in obedience to the Torah. Therefore, what he's really teaching is that salvation comes through walking in obedience to the Torah. So there's some confusion within Steve's theology on this point. He says the law was designed for instruction, not salvation. And yet the sum total of his teachings is that salvation comes through the law. And of course, the idea that salvation comes from the law is heresy. Now, I certainly don't want to downplay the fact that the natural outworking of an authentic faith in God is a desire to obey Him. So faith and obedience are very much linked. But mercifully, God doesn't require our obedience in order to save us. All He requires is our faith, meaning our trust, our belief. For by grace you have been saved through walking in obedience to the Torah. No, that's not what it says. Have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, not as a result of walking in obedience to the Torah, so that no one may boast. Salvation does not come through walking in obedience to the Torah, as Steve essentially teaches. And that critical error leads him to make some dangerous statements. Let me give you 2 quick examples, and then we'll start walking through his teaching. First, he says,
sin is breaking the Torah.
Now that's an incomplete and very misleading definition of sin. If sin was solely defined as breaking the law of Moses, then Adam and Eve never sinned. Not only because the law hadn't been given yet, but also because they didn't break any Mosaic commands. No, the Bible defines sin broadly, and the word for sin in Hebrew is hatah, which means missing the mark, or being wrong, or even offending. And it refers to any level or type of disobedience or rebelliousness towards God. Now, for those under the law, was it a sin to break the law? Of course. But sin isn't limited to breaking the law of Moses, which was a specific set of commands given at a specific time to a particular people group. Disobeying God was sinful long before the law of Moses was given. There are a number of different movements out there, most commonly known as Hebrew roots, but some call themselves Torah-observant Christians or Torah keepers, or some even use the strange term pronomian Christianity. And the thing all these movements have in common is that they view Scripture through a distorted Torah-centric lens, which is why I refer to that broad theology as Torahism. This is the general movement that Steve's part of. Now, don't misunderstand, the Torah itself is beautiful and holy and true and part of our sacred Scripture. But Torahism distorts Scripture by viewing the work and teachings of Jesus through the lens of the law of Moses, rather than viewing the law of Moses through the lens of Jesus. They're looking through the wrong end of the telescope and making everything smaller and further away than it really is. And here's the second incorrect statement Steve makes based on looking through the wrong end of the telescope.
Abraham, the father of the faith, walked according to the Torah.
What's interesting about Steve saying this is there's a passage right here in Galatians 3 that disproves this statement. But it's not a passage that Steve mentioned in his teaching. In Galatians 3:17, Paul says that the law of Moses came 430 years after Abraham. So no, Abraham didn't walk according to the law of Moses. In fact, what made Abraham righteous is something Paul pointed out, again, right here in Galatians 3, in another verse that Steve didn't mention. In Galatians 3:6, Paul points his readers to Genesis 15, where it says, "And he, Abraham, believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness." It doesn't say that Abraham walked according to the Torah and it was counted to him as righteousness. It says he believed the Lord. He had faith. And that's what put him in right standing with God. So no, the faith Abraham exercised wasn't walking in obedience to the law of Moses. That law wouldn't even exist for another 430 years. Okay, so let's lay out the case that Steve makes in his video. And remember, I've linked to an outline of his teaching below in case you find that helpful. So again, The whole point of Steve's video is to explain the tutor mentioned in Galatians 3, verses 24 and 25. And that passage says this, and I'll cite the NASB 1995 translation, since that's one Steve seems comfortable with. Therefore, the law has become our tutor to lead us to Christ, so that we may be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor. Now, the traditional Christian interpretation of this passage is pretty straightforward, that the law, the tutor, was given to lead God's people until Jesus arrived. And now that Jesus has arrived, God's people are no longer under a law, no longer under a tutor. This is the plain reading of the text, and it spells disaster for Torahism. Because if Paul's teaching here that the law was only given until Jesus arrived, then Torahism, which teaches that all Christians are required to keep the law of Moses today, is completely wrong. Which is why Steve offers an alternate interpretation of this passage. And he builds his case on 3 claims. So let's look at those claims in the order he presented them. Steve first claims that when verse 25 says we are no longer under a tutor, it's not talking about the law of Moses, but rather the curse of the law.
The context in Galatians chapter 3 is all about the curse of the law being done away with, as shown here in verse 13. When Paul said the curse of the law, he's actually referencing the law of sin and death, that which comes from breaking the Torah, as seen here in Deuteronomy 11, verses 26 through 28. It's important to understand how Paul references the curse of the law as a law itself. Many miss this important point, so I'm going to say it again. He calls the curse that came from disobedience to the law of Yahweh a law itself.
So Steve's argument goes like this. Deuteronomy 11 says there's a curse for those Israelites who do not obey the law of Moses. And Paul elsewhere refers to this curse as a law itself. According to Steve, in Romans 7, this is what Paul calls the law of sin and death. And therefore, in Galatians 3, 24 and 25, this is the law that Paul is referring to. In other words, the tutor is not the law of Moses, but the curse of the law.
So the law that was put in charge, the tutor, was the curse of the law. Again, the tutor was the curse of the law of sin and death. It's the curse of the law, as mentioned in verse 13, that we are no longer under, as mentioned in verse 25. The tutor was the curse of the law that is done away with in Yeshua.
Okay, so there are at least 4 big problems with Steve's theological conclusion, which you may have already noticed. First of all, the law of sin and death that Paul mentions in Romans 7 isn't tied to the curse of the law given in Deuteronomy 11. In fact, Paul doesn't refer to that curse anywhere in the book of Romans. Now, Steve makes this connection, but there's no evidence for it, and he gives no reason in support of it. And secondly, the same thing is true of Steve's claim that Paul refers to that Mosaic curse as a law itself. Steve doesn't give us a reason or any evidence in support of this claim. He just says it's true. And third, in the immediate context of Galatians 3, where Paul does mention a curse for disobeying the law of Moses, he refers to it as a curse, not a law itself. And lastly, the law of sin, or the law of sin and death, isn't mentioned in Galatians 3 at all. In fact, in all of the New Testament, those phrases only exist in Romans chapters 7 and 8. That's it. So Steve makes the claim that the tutor in Galatians 3:25 is a reference to the curse of the law.
Again, the tutor was the curse of the law of sin and death.
But that idea isn't found in the text of Galatians 3. And in his video, Steve offers no explanation for making that connection, nor any scriptural evidence to support it. And it's interesting that to make his case, Steve chose to take us to the curse in Deuteronomy 11 and then try to link that to the law of sin and death in Romans 7, and then try to carry that connection over into Galatians 3. This is a chain of arbitrary, unsupported connections that leads to Steve's completely false conclusion. And here's the thing. To understand what Paul's referring to when he says tutor, We don't even have to leave the immediate context of Galatians 3. Paul tells us what he means right in the text. And that's exactly what we're going to unpack in our next video when we study this chapter in detail. And when we understand what Paul's really teaching here, it's no surprise that Hebrew roots teachers like Steve have to scramble to come up with alternate interpretations. Steve's second claim targets the meaning of the faith that's mentioned in verse 25, which says, "But now that faith has come, we're no longer under a tutor."
Okay, before what faith came? Is this faith something completely new to believers? When we read Hebrews chapter 11, we see faith was very much a part of the believer's life before Yeshua came. To know what faith Paul is talking about here in Galatians 3, we need to see what he said about this faith in Romans chapter 10.
So again, rather than interpreting what faith Paul is talking about from the immediate context of Galatians 3, Steve instead, for reasons he doesn't mention, takes us over to Romans 10, verses 5 through 8. And that's a passage where Paul's talking about salvation, and it says in part, "For Moses writes about the righteousness that is based on the law, that the person who does the commandments shall live by them. But the righteousness based on faith says, the word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart. And that is the word of faith that we proclaim." And here's the conclusion Steve draws.
Did you know Paul is quoting from the law on both accounts here? On both accounts, regarding the law and the law of righteousness that is by faith. He's quoting the Torah for both. The word of faith that Paul was proclaiming was the law.
What? The faith Paul was proclaiming was the law? Not even close. And how does Steve come to this conclusion? Well, he doesn't say. All he mentions is that Paul quoted from the law, which is true. Paul cites Deuteronomy 30 in this passage. But what's Paul teaching here? He's contrasting the righteousness that's based on the law in verse 5 with the righteousness that's based on faith in verse 6. So what we have here is Steve jumping over to a passage in Romans 10, and he doesn't explain why he chose Romans 10, and drawing an unexplained and an erroneous conclusion about what it says, and then he imports that incorrect conclusion back into Galatians 3, which leads him to the following quite problematic statement.
So, before every individual comes to obedience in the Torah, they're held captive to the law of sin. And remember, sin is breaking the Torah. Thus, Paul's words in Galatians 3, verses 22 through 24.
Whoa, did you catch that? Steve said,
"Before every individual comes to obedience in the Torah, they're held captive to the law of sin."
He's teaching that we're held captive to the law of sin until we come to obedience in the Torah. In other words, it's obedience to the Torah that frees us from the law of sin. Double check me on this.
Before every individual comes to obedience in the Torah, they're held captive to the law of sin.
That's not what the Bible teaches. Scripture says that the Torah helps point out our sin, but it's Jesus who frees us from the law of sin and death, not the Torah. And then Steve summarizes his argument about faith.
So the whole world was bound in sin. And this faith Paul is talking about is the faith of walking in the Torah as given by Moses and rightly preached by Yeshua.
Can you see how his teachings draw our attention away from the saving work of Jesus and towards the law of Moses? He talks about the faith of walking in the Torah rather than the faith of believing and trusting in Yeshua. And he teaches that obedience to the Torah frees us from the law of sin, when it was really Jesus who did that. This is dangerous stuff. For the third claim in Steve's argument that the tutor we're no longer under isn't the law of Moses, but rather the curse of the law, Steve says this.
Galatians 3:19 proves this isn't the law of Yahweh, but rather disobedience to it.
How so? Well, verse 19 says that the law was added because of transgressions, and
you don't have transgression unless you have something to transgress against. Thus, we read in Deuteronomy 11:26 through 28, the curse of the law comes from disobedience to the law. transgression. Thus the tutor.
Holy non sequitur, Batman. Transgression, thus the tutor? Okay, so the accepted traditional translation of Galatians 3:25 is, now that faith has come, meaning now that Jesus has come, or now that faith in Jesus has come, we're no longer under a tutor. We're no longer under the law of Moses. And then in the next video, I'm going to show you why that interpretation is correct. But in stark contrast to that, Steve interprets this verse to mean, well, I'm not exactly sure what that would be because he never directly interprets it for us in his video. In fact, for the sake of argument, let's just take him at face value and read through this passage using Steve's own definitions. Let's read through Galatians 3, verses 24 and 25, using Steve's definitions and see what it says. Now remember that Steve defined faith as walking in obedience to the Torah.
This faith Paul is talking about is the faith of walking in the Torah.
And he defined the tutor as the curse of the law.
The tutor was the curse of the law that is done away with in Yeshua.
Okay, so where does that leave us with? Therefore, the curse of the law has become our tutor to lead us to Christ, so that we may be justified by walking in the Torah. But now that walking in the Torah has come, we're no longer under the curse of the law. So even if we were to extend a generous portion of grace to Steve, this interpretation falls flat on its face. First of all, it makes the curse of the law a tutor. So Steve's interpretation says that it's not the law of Moses that was given to teach and guide God's people like a tutor, but rather it was the curse of the law that was given to guide them. That doesn't make sense. And second, Steve's translation also says we're justified, we're made right with God by keeping the law of Moses. This is 100% heresy. Our justification comes through faith, through belief or trust in Jesus alone. And thirdly, the phrase, but now that walking in the Torah has come, is really awkward. Is Steve suggesting that prior to Jesus, people didn't walk in the Torah? And lastly, the phrase, we are no longer under the curse of the law, means something that I don't think Steve intended or really thought through. He would then be arguing that although the law of Moses is required of Christians, which is his position, there's no longer a curse for disobeying it. In other words, Jesus didn't do away with the law of Moses, he only did away with the curse for disobeying it. So what? Jesus made it okay to disobey the law of Moses? As we wrap up, let me show you one last thing. Let's look at the verses from Galatians 3 that Steve included in his teaching. It helps to see this visually. And remember, the whole point of his video was to explain the tutor mentioned in verses 24 and 25. And here are the verses from that chapter that Steve cited. Did anything jump out at you about this? The thing that struck me is how many verses that Steve didn't mention. He skipped a lot of stuff, including verses that have a direct impact on understanding what the tutor's all about. It almost looks like he was cherry picking. Okay, so we've spent quite a bit of time dissecting Steve's teaching and showing where he got things wrong. And this is important stuff. But I don't just want to camp out on the negative side of this issue. It's also really important that we spend time studying Galatians 3 to see what it does teach. And that's what we're going to do in the next video. Thanks for watching. Shalom.